I don't know how many of you usually come to these types of events we organize in the Center for Digital Trust and Society, but if it's your first time, welcome to the center. Very, very happy to see you all here today. I was talking to Ben before, and we wanted to have an idea which kinds of participants would be in the room today. So if you could just raise your hand real quick if you are an academic. Hands raised. Okay. Coming from industry? You're from industry? There you go. Nice. And public sector? Okay, very mixed. So that makes your job extremely complicated. No, not really. It will be fine. Kitty has asked me to give some notes at the beginning. So toilets, you will see in both screens where they are. They are not easy to find. Like this building wasn't easy to find. I think it's down there, and then turn left after the lift, if I'm correct. But if you don't find it, just ask us and we will point you to the toilets. There are no fire alarms planned, so if the alarm rings, we need to leave the building and follow to the meeting point, which is down there, in the parking. They will be taking some photos during the session, so if any of you don't want to be part of the photos, just let us know, and we will make sure that, I don't know, your photo is erased or we point in a different direction. And if someone wants a risk assessment, we can also provide it. And I've never been told to provide a risk assessment, but these kind of things that we are asked to do before this type of sessions. The toilet is over there, so if you need to go, you go down the corridor. And now we're going to get started with the session from today's speaker, which is Ben Collier. He's coming from Edinburgh. I don't know if you guys have been following his work, but he's one of the rising stars in criminology and also in technology. He has done quite a lot of work, very interesting work on the Tor network, using a variety of methods, including ethnography, but also data science and advanced quantitative methods. I'm just going to give you 3 quick remarks about his biography, his career, so you have a good understanding of, the person that is in front of you. And also we're going to appreciate also a little bit the type of findings that we will be sharing with us today. So he is a criminologist, but his research is at the intersection of criminology and technology. He's currently a lecturer in digital methods at the University of Edinburgh, but before he was a postdoc at the Cybercrime Institute at the University of Cambridge. He has undertaken quite a lot of ethnographic research on the Tor network, and he published just last year the book titled Tor from the Dark Web to the Future of Privacy with MIT Press, and highly recommended for everyone. Maybe you can also tell us a bit about that if you have time. He also has done research on crime, so how digital technologies facilitate crime and resistance. He has published quite a lot of papers on that, and now he's leading a couple of highly influential projects within government. One is called Influence Government, and the other one, Influence Policing, and where he explores how the use of digital technologies can be used in campaigns to prevent cybercrime and prevent fraud and related behaviors. And I think he's going to be telling us a little bit about that today. So thanks a lot, Ben, for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you around. And yeah, you have around 45 minutes for your talk.
Lovely, thank you very much. Hello everyone, I'm going to sort of try and, I'm not sure where the best place to go is. I might try and go here, oh no, because my water's there. So I'm going to take my water with me. It is really, really great to be here at Manchester, and brilliant. I was really excited to get the invitation from David, because I first encountered David's work, I think, in my master's, and then early on in my PhD, I remember reading a lot of your stuff. And so it was sort of like, yeah, very nice to get the invitation, and yeah, really pleased to be here speaking. So I am Ben Collier, I'm from the University of Edinburgh, but the work I'm going to be talking about today has not just been done by me, it's been done by a sort of cohort of people at a number of different institutions. So we've got myself, James Stewart from Edinburgh, Lydia Wilson, who works at Cambridge, but she's also a journalist, Shane Horgan at Edinburgh Napier University, Gemma Flynn and Daniel Thomas at the University of Strathclyde as well. And the talk today is going to be on something called influence policing. So It's a bit of a complicated talk. It's quite, it's quite big. But essentially what I'm talking about here is a move in the way that the police and government use social media. So there's been a lot of really, really good and very influential criminological scholarship on police use as users of social media. So social media platforms come out and the police make accounts on them and they use those accounts to talk to the public. So essentially this goes from the broadcast mode where you release a press release or do a public statement to a dialogical mode where you can actually speak to the public backwards and forwards. For various reasons this becomes quite difficult. The public quite like to shout at you, you don't have a lot of authority in online spaces, and so what we see is a move to a much more strategic form of police and government use of social media. So here the police are not entering this as users, they're actually entering it as advertisers. So they're buying ad space, they're using the strategic position of the network effectively to do domestic influence campaigns for preventative policy. So using the tools and techniques of online advertising and behavioural science to actually shape people's perceptions of the world, their behaviours, and to prevent crime. So there's my book. It is also actually, feel free to buy it, but actually it is available for free in its entirety on the MIT Press website. So essentially this talk's going to be in a few different parts. Firstly I'm going to talk a bit about social marketing, so this is the kind of science of advertising bit, and this particularly the science of using advertising to shape what the public do, not their commercial behaviours, but kind of preventative social behaviours. I'll then talk a bit about what digital ads targeting adds to this environment, and I'll give a bit of a summary at that point on influence policing as we think it exists. So this new emerging mode of governance, of sort of a new set of tools for the state to use, for the police to use, to prevent crime, but also other forms of social prevention. This is going to be quite serious stuff at the start, so it's going to be backgroundy, not a lot of empirical data there. But then the second half of the talk is going to be largely empirically based. So first we're going to look at Police Scotland's strategic communications team, who actually do this stuff day in, day out. This is their main job, is doing these kind of behaviour change communications for crime prevention. They give us a lot of access, so they let us in, they let us do interviews, a bit of sort of observation and a lot of documents. So we could find out actually how they composed these campaigns, how they thought they work, what they did, and how they evaluated them as well. We'll then go on to the UK landscape. So I'll talk a bit about what we actually did there, what this looks like in police forces and counter-terror work across the UK. And that bit's going to focus mostly on the targeting itself. So because of the type of data we had access to, we mostly had access to how the police targeted these communications. I've chosen a number of examples that show how essentially using the capacities of the platform infrastructure, so Facebook, Twitter, Google, how the sorts of targeting that this actually allows in practice, we've taken particularly sort of extreme or shocking or quite astonishing versions of this, and you can see some of the potential problems that this might cause if it's not sort of accountably administered. And then I'll finish by sort of talking about where this is all going. But first I'm going to talk a bit about social marketing. So we really see the science of social marketing emerge in the 1970s. So in the 1960s you have the mass media, mass culture boom, and we see millions and millions of pounds, lots of people, expertise, university departments reorient around using the mass culture market to sell things. So this is where we see the early science of commercial advertising really take hold, really get a lot of power, and actually sort of start to develop as a coherent science. And in the early 1970s, we see governments start to take an interest in this. So they say, well, actually, there's all this expertise, all this money, all these different tools and techniques that are emerging in commercial marketing, and we want to use it as well, but to market things that don't have a product or a price associated with them. So essentially to market changes in human behavior. Now, you might think, isn't this just sort of age-old sort of Soviet-style propaganda messaging, right? So the classic one I always talk about is there are these Twitter accounts that post like old Soviet propaganda, and there's one I really like which is saying, if you've washed your clothes in gasoline, don't dry them next to the fire, which is pretty obvious. But this is quite distinctive. This is not sort of British wartime or Soviet wartime propaganda. Instead, this isn't really talking to people as a nation. It's not really talking to people as a social class or national identity. Instead, it is engaged with the new identities that are emerging out of consumer culture. So identities based around where we buy, how we live our lives, what we're doing. It's going out into the community, into the country, and saying, well, what social groups actually are out there, what different lives are people living, and how can we use this to tailor the advertising we're actually doing, so by listening to markets. This is called segmenting the public. And it's the idea that you target different communications to different people. If I'm speaking to elderly people in Manchester, I will use different language, different images, different ideas to speaking to young people in Glasgow. I won't go too much into the kind of the cyberneticist stuff here, but really this is a kind of difference. This is this evolution of these sort of what we call high modernist ideas of the post-war British state. The idea you can sort of design society from the top down and sort of tell people what to do. Instead, this is much more complex. This is about trying to encourage some behaviours and discourage others and set up these feedback loops. So initially, this is mostly focused on health. It's mostly focused on health campaigns, sort of go to your GP, brush your teeth, eat healthy food, and it's using the advertising infrastructure that's available at the time. So we don't have internet-based targeting in the 1970s. Instead, this is, a poster in your local GP surgery, adverts in the commercial breaks on television and on the radio. And obviously this gives you fairly limited ways that you can segment the population, that you can target your adverts. So we can figure out, well, who lives near this GP surgery? We'll maybe tailor the adverts a bit to the people that are in the local area. Who listens to this type of radio program? We'll maybe tailor that as well. In the 1980s, we see this sort of move towards police advertising campaign and police awareness campaigns. So essentially, this reflects, and there's quite a lot of criminological literature on this, a move to the sort of neoliberal model of policing, where we encourage people to buy security products. So we say, the police, you've now got all these consumer goods in your house. It's not really the job of the police to be the sole person looking out for you there. So we're going to encourage you to buy better locks for your house, buy a security camera, lock up your stuff. And a lot of this takes the form of awareness campaigns to allow people, everyday people, to buy security in a market for solutions. Now, at this point, as you can see, this is largely relying on fairly simple modes of communication. Essentially point to people and say, we're the police. You should do this. Why should you do this? Because we're the ones telling you, right? Now, this does develop further. And so across the 1990s, we see a lot of development of what might be called the science of government. So this continues to the 2010s, and it's kind of still continuing to this day. And the idea of sort of scientific, evidence-based development of policing modes really kind of starts in the late 1980s and develops and strengthens across the 1990s. This is the idea that instead of just doing stuff, we could sort of see what actually happens when you do it. You could measure, provide an evidence base, see if something that works in one place works in another place, and this begins to get applied to communications across the 1990s. Now, in the sort of late 2000s, this develops into a sort of full theory of government, theory of governance, called nudge. So at this point, and it's sort of tenuously linked to the financial crisis, we have this huge failure of non-intervention. And people essentially say, well, a lot of people in government and making policy say, well, okay, this kind of fairly laissez-faire, market-based governance isn't really working. Government needs to step in. And Thaler and Sunstein proposed this idea of nudge, behavioural science-based government, and it's based on this idea of libertarian paternalism. So we've got this paternalistic idea, which is government can't just stand back and not do anything. We have to do stuff to promote good social outcomes. However, we also have this libertarian part of the philosophy, this idea that, well, people aren't going to do stuff just because we tell them to. Instead, we need to think of clever, scientific ways to deliver policy in the form of nudge. So what this essentially does is, instead of telling people what to do, what decisions they should make, you rework the choice environment in which people make those decisions. You do things, some of them materials, some of them communications-based, to make the decision that the government wants you to make easier, and the decisions that we don't want you to make to be harder. So some really good examples of this are in cigarette cessation, so getting people to stop smoking. So you put the cigarettes, instead of being out in the aisles, you put them behind the counter, so they're actually just physically harder to get. You ban advertising, so people don't get a trigger for their addiction when they walk in the shop. You then put your own communications on. You put these sort of horrible images on cigarette packets so that people get a sort of negative association over time with smoking. All these different ways to nudge the choice environment. And communications is a big part of this as well. A lot of this sort of involves scientifically studying the environments in which people make choices about their behaviors, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and then trying to tweak little bits of it to achieve a particular outcome. Now at this point, sort of late 2000s, we do have this sort of science of communication and we have behavioral communications, but actually the modes of delivery and segmentation are still really quite basic. We're still pretty much stuck with posters, TV advertising, a bit postcode advertising, and information campaigns that look a bit sort of prehistoric. Then something big happens. I'm sure you can all guess what that is. It's social media. This is an absolutely huge change to the information and media environment that emerges with the rise of what's often called surveillance capitalism and social media platforms. So this business model of surveillance capitalism, I will briefly explain. Every year that goes by, I need to explain this less and less because it's so much about how we live our lives. Essentially, big internet platforms live on something called the network effect. So if one person is using Facebook, it's completely useless. If 10 people are using Facebook, it's all right. If 1 billion people are using Facebook, suddenly it's absolutely essential that you be on there. You get huge benefits of it. The way that platforms cultivate this network effect initially is by giving it away for free. They say, well, we're not going to charge you to use our internet platforms at all to make it so that loads and loads of people rush onto these platforms, start using them, and so the benefits get better and better. However, so the service is offered for free. You don't pay to have a Facebook account. You don't pay to search Google. But you are effectively the product. So the information that you put on these platforms, through your searches, through your Facebook statuses, the information it collects around you, is collected by the platforms and it's monetized directly as a set of profiles or categories. So this can be anything from things you've liked on Facebook, which they can use to figure out what you're interested in. It can be based on recent behavior, so I'm Googling where to buy cannabis in Edinburgh, so that's a sort of immediate thing. It can know what I'm doing in the moment. It might be location, so it knows I'm walking past a coffee shop at a particular time, so advertisers can bid on that to sell me at. So you're essentially mediating access, and we'll see a bit of this later in the talk, to these huge surveillance networks. And this is quite an abstract idea. People think, oh, what sort of stuff might they have there? We're going to see some of these different constellations they can build around you as a person to do targeted marketing. And this actually opens up a lot more scope for government and police science in messaging. So you can say, well, okay, how do we tailor adverts not just to people who are in this particular GP surgery, but people of a particular ethnicity who've read a particular book at a particular time and are currently in this postcode? And that gives you, it's potentially a massive invasion of your privacy, but it also gives the state a lot more tools for doing this type of behavioral communication. It gives you a lot more tools to test and tailor adverts. You can see who's watching your ad at a given time, and you can also see what they do next. So it sets you up far more capacity to actually see what the effects of your communications are, which communications tend to get more engagement, this kind of thing, and potentially to shape people's behavior. So you take these three things together. You take strategic communications, you take behavioral science, and you take the capacities of the internet platforms, and you get what we call influence policing. Now this aligns with a number of other things that are going on policing at the time in the early 2010s. The increasing prominence of behavioral science in lots of different bits of policing, a more general move to prevention, and actually the influence of generally the influence of prevent on wider policing, the idea that policing is moving from reactive to proactive. And what this effectively looks like, and we'll see some examples of this, is police launch these behaviour change campaigns, so essentially preventative. They surveil populations, they map different risk segments, so people that are at different forms of risk and levels of risk for particular types of offending or victimisation, and they target behavioural interventions to these particular risk segments. So, what does this actually look like? That's great. So I usually do this talk in a slightly shorter time, so I have to skip through all the Scottish stuff, but I'm not going to today. So yeah, we got some access to Police Scotland's strategic communications team. So we'd initially, and I'll talk about this later on, accidentally evaluated one of these campaigns by essentially stumbling onto it while we were doing research on something else. And we emailed a bunch of police forces in the UK, or police services, to say, are you doing any of this behavioural police communication stuff? And Scotland was one of the first forces to get back to us, and they said, oh yeah, we've got a whole unit that does this. And we spoke to them, and they gave us quite a lot of access. So I should actually say, I forgot to say this at the start, a small sort of content warning here for some of what we're going to talk about. I did mean to say this at the beginning. So in this bit of the talk on Police Scotland, I'm going to talk about police behavioural campaigns, but it also involves, it's not going to involve any horrible images or things like that, but it is going to talk a bit about child sexual exploitation, some of the campaigns that developed around that, and other forms of kind of offending. I'll do a separate content warning for the stuff that's the counter-terror campaigns, which have sort of different things associated with them. But yeah, so Police Scotland Strategic Communications Team. This is set up in 2018, and this is a legacy of the amalgamation of Police Scotland from several different forces into a single national force. Essentially what this means is, you take lots of wee forces, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Northern, Highlands, etc. They've all got small communications departments associated with them that largely do PR and local awareness. When you amalgamate them into a single force, you also amalgamate all of the communications departments and capacities of those local forces. This gives you lots of people together, and it gives you more resources to do big national specialist projects. And that's what they do. And they basically see this approach across the public sector for doing strategic communications. This is something the Government Communication Service is really pushing at this time. And they say, well, let's see what this can do for policing. So we interviewed them, and we did some case studies. So what they initially started to do, so they've got like a kind of core of about 4 or 5 strategic communicators in this specialist unit. And they said, well, okay, currently what we're doing is we've got all these little awareness campaigns all over Scotland. And instead of doing this, we're going to move from that to a small number of fully Scottish national behaviour change strategic communications programmes. And they're going to be strategic. They're not just going to be randomly based on the priorities of like whoever happens to be in the comms team at that time. Instead, it's going to be on the key police goals for the year. So the key strategic areas of policing for the year. There's also a big move away here from awareness and authority. So they say, we're not doing awareness campaigns anymore because there's no proof that they change behaviour. There's no proof that if you it's very hard to evidence what an awareness campaign has actually done. Instead, we want to try and find more strategic ways of doing this to actually directly shape behaviour. And they move away from authority. So instead of being like Judge Dredd saying littering is an offence, citizen, they want to start using these more sort of different voices of the police. Not just shouting at people, not just telling people what to do, but actually using marketing science to try and shape narratives. And they use initially the kind of COM-B method. This is basically routine activities theory, sort of a bit of situational stuff here. So it's, if you change your behaviour, you need to have the capacity to do so, an opportunity to do so, and I think M is motivation to do so. So what these are is basically a useful behaviour science framework for taking lots and lots of different types of information, and we're going to see some of this, about crime, and fitting them into something you can use to design a communications campaign. And there's a big move to sort of delivering online. Additionally, and this is kind of quite important for the kind of what Police Scotland see as their core values of communications, there's a real move away from victim-centred communications and survivor-centred communications. So historically at this point, a lot of police communications were targeting the victims or survivors of serious crimes. So saying like, here are ways you can protect yourself from this crime, or here are things to do after you've been victimised, etc. And they say, well, actually, that's not who we should be speaking to. Let's start speaking to people who are perpetrators of crime and trying to change their behaviour. So, what they essentially do is, the leadership comes up with strategic priorities, and then they go through an insight process. And on the next slide, I'll finally show you some actual data. So this is loads and loads and loads of different types of information about the particular type of crime that they're looking at. So they'll use data from police intelligence and the PNC to build sort of situational profiles of what that crime looks like, what the average criminal, the criminogenic situation looks like, who's doing it, what they're doing, and why. They build psychological profiles, opportunity and situational profiles, and they actually pull a lot of detail from other partners in justice, so particularly people who are working at survivor organisations, service providers, things like this. And this all boils down to finding the nudge. So we're looking at the entire situational architecture of the choice environment that the perpetrator is in when they choose, and we can obviously critique this a bit, but when they choose to engage in criminal behavior, and they're thinking, is there anything there to make that choice slightly harder? You know, tweak little aspects of that situation. At this point, you've got your insights process done. You know what your nudge is going to be, and you've got an idea about how you're going to try and poke it, basically. At that point, they then build a much more traditional audience profile. Now, this is quite interesting in itself as well. This is what you would do if you were sort of Coca-Cola or Nike trying to advertise to someone. They look at the people they're trying to reach with these communications and they say, okay, what books do they read? What clothes do they wear? Where do they go to the pub? What stuff do they watch on television? Do they listen to the radio? What sort of device do they use? Should we be getting them on Xbox? Should we be advertising there? Are they mostly going to be sort of reachable through video games ads? Things like this. Now that is what you would expect a marketing agency to do. It's quite interesting that the police are doing this kind of research. And I think that in itself raises some questions of accountability as well. Then they develop and deliver the campaign. So this is going to be, this is what a campaign, and I'll show you the graphic for it as well. Targeting people that are at risk of engaging in CSA grooming online. And here are some of the profiles that went into this sort of situational nudge thing. So we can see here, this is part of the insights report, they say they've got these different offender types. There's low-functioning, socially isolated, high-functioning, socially isolated, aggressive versus non-aggressive, etc. So we're doing some kind of profiling behavior here. There's also a psychological profile. Now this is important not just for targeting, but also for actually developing what the nudge communication is going to be, emotionally inadequate, depressive, lack of empathy, etc. And here we can see this is a kind of who it's actually targeted report. So this is a kind of offender profile. All sexually active men in Scotland is the kind of the big profile, but then they kind of narrow it down into particular types of groups, particular segments. And this, sorry, I know it's a lot of text, this is the kind of key thing that develops the nudge campaign. So they say existing campaigns are largely focused on empathy and largely focused on trying to develop empathy for victims. But actually this doesn't seem to work particularly for this target group, the people that they're actually trying to change the behavior of. Instead, they're much more focused on consequences for themselves. And so they develop a campaign about heightening the perception of consequences and the likelihood of consequences. And actually, there's really a lot of research went into this, including doing interviews with sort of former offenders and things like this. So this is creating the campaign. This was less our focus because we're particularly interested in the targeting and development. But this campaign went through two evolutions. So the first one you can see is kind of trying to play on this sort of heightening the idea of consequences. They used emojis because they thought it would sort of link with the online environment a bit. And actually they ran these as separate campaigns and they could evaluate individually how changes in the messaging, changes in the image resulted in different effects on the target group. This is quite a basic sort of campaign. You can see this develops into this, and this is a really classic nudge campaign. So we can see here two very prominent, very striking eyes. It feels very intimidating. This is a really classic behavioral psychology technique for communications, using the visually prominent eyes to sort of shock and grab attention. And there's a lot of modulation of kind of tone of voice and things like this. So they're also doing quite a lot of stuff. When you're actually targeting this kind of campaign, and the rest of the talk's really going to be about how these campaigns are targeted, you can use all this intelligence, all these profiles, to build the segment on the platform. So actually to tell these Facebook, Google, Meta, etc. Meta is Facebook, Twitter, these are the people I want to reach and how. We can use age and demographics, that's pretty classic, but also what they're interested in. A lot of this is consumer behavior. Which platforms they're on, what behavior is not quite the same as interest. This is sort of what you're doing online. So instead of being like, I'm interested in football, this might be regularly goes online after 8 p.m. at night, for example. And location, we're going to see some really interesting examples of the use of location. This is quite an interesting campaign. I don't have the graphic for this up, but this shows you just how targeted the location can get. This was a campaign targeting people who had recently been victimized by essentially knife crime, but people that they felt were at high risk of going on to basically attack someone else with a knife after immediate victimization. And you can see here they're targeting around I think 2 police stations and a hospital. What's interesting about this campaign is it was run in Glasgow and in Dundee, so East Coast and West Coast. If you were served this campaign in Glasgow, the voiceover would have a Glaswegian accent, and if you were serviced in Dundee, they would have a Dundonian accent. So again, this is a kind of behavioural science insight that people are more likely to listen to communications that sound like themselves. So evaluation of this stuff is really, really hard. There are detailed platform metrics, so the platform tells you a lot about who's seeing it, but they don't tell you much about what that person is really going to do next. It's very good about telling you what their online behaviours are, can't tell you anything about their sort of physical behaviours after they see the ad, and if you had any effect on them. A lot of the evaluation here involves getting particularly sort of service user organisations, so organisations that work with people who are at risk of offending, to see, well, have people been contacting you more? Have they mentioned the campaign? But it is quite difficult. We were very lucky in evaluating one of these campaigns because we had a sort of a quite weird source of data that I'll tell you about later. I won't go into that. So, that's what's happening in Scotland. Just take a drink of water. That's what's happening in Scotland. What about outside of Scotland? So we were really interested because we were like, well, if Scotland, we're basically in the 1970s. If we're doing this, then presumably everyone else has been doing it for sort of 10 years, right? And we were interested in looking in England, Wales and Northern Ireland to see, okay, well, what sorts of things are happening there? And we wrote to the Home Office and said, can you please tell us about all your sort of police domestic influence campaigns that you're currently running, how you're targeting them, what you're using them for, that kind of thing. What do you think they said? Oh, they said no. They said, yeah, we're not going to do that. But instead we wrote to Facebook at the time and said, you've got your ad library of all the adverts that have been run. Do you mind if we have a swatch at it? Like, send us some of the data and sort of anything being run by police in the UK. And they did. They sent us 16,000 campaigns that have been run over the past sort of, like, several years, which is great. And how they're targeted, how many people had seen them. And so we've got this big ad library data set, and I'm going to show you some of these campaigns. We see them being used across England, Wales and Northern Ireland in a lot of different forces, usually bigger forces that have got this capacity to do real strategic stuff, and agencies, so kind of centralised national policing agencies, usually specialised in forms of serious and organised crime, because again, they've got the capacity to do it. We also see a lot in counter-extremism. And there's a mix of really, really simple and really, really bespoke targeting. Now, this is where the content warning comes in. So we have focused for this presentation on how you actually target people and on showcasing some of the different, very elaborate ways that different campaigns are attempting to nudge groups, but also attempting to use this infrastructure to reach groups. So some of the topics are quite shocking. Some of the stuff the campaigns are being used for, I think most people would be quite critical of. It's not necessarily a fair description of everything that's currently going on. I've focused on ones that are more sort of eye-catching or shocking or things like that. So they're going to show you some campaigns. Some of them are on radicalisation. Some of the targeting is quite racist in some places. And one of the campaigns in particular is a bit upsetting. It's targeting asylum seekers in Calais with behavioural communications. So just so you're aware, obviously if you want to leave, I have had people leave during this bit before, so that's grand if you do want to take some time out. So I'll go through some of these campaigns. There's a few different models. So these are behavioural campaigns that often look quite different from one another, and I'll go through some of the ways these are being used differently. Perfect. So the first one is a kind of type of campaign we call choice-based campaigns. And when we say choice, we actually mean consumer choice. So this is a Police Scotland campaign called the That Guy campaign. Has anyone seen the That Guy campaign? You may know it, there's the Enough campaign, which is the English version of this run by the Home Office. So this is targeting men that are sort of in precursor group, is initially targeting men who are sort of precursor risk for committing serious violence against women. And this evolved into a campaign, essentially they looked at that and they said, well, men that are going to be committing serious violence against women are very hard to reach, they're very hard to influence with these sort of ads. So they said, well, let's target those people's friends. Let's use an influence campaign on those people's friends so they can then deliver peer influence to those people. So this basically goes through, the guy's got a Scottish accent, he's sort of talking in a very friendly way, and he's saying basically, if one of your friends starts to say this stuff, here are some kind of tricks and techniques, if you're uncomfortable, to kind of show them in a non-confrontational way that it's not okay. Maybe approach them afterwards, things like that. And there is a sort of, whether this is nudge or not, I think they certainly think it's a nudge campaign. I think it's a classic kind of, in some ways, police branding campaign. A lot of it is about like, what sort of a person do you want to be? So there's a real consumer choice element. But this is how it was targeted. So this wasn't on Facebook, this was on Twitter, so the targeting looks different. We can see lots of stuff. So it's targeted people age 18 to 34, keywords indicating that they're in a relationship, that they're dating. It's geo-targeted to Scotland, and it's heterosexual men in a relationship. So it's quite a wide campaign, right? This is targeting a large proportion of the Scottish population. But additionally, it's quite interesting that the police are targeting behaviour change campaigns based on your relationship status. That's an interesting thing for the police to be doing. This then turned into the Enough campaign, which was taken up by the UK government. And you can see this is extremely broad. Men, 16 to 39, England and Wales. And this is what you get at the ad library, basically. You get the targeting, this is how you can target people on the platform, the content and how many people saw it, various other bits. So we can see here, estimated audience size, more than 1 million people. Obviously there are more than 1 million men, aged 16 to 39 in England and Wales. Number of impressions, rubbish, 45,000, right? And that's because if you're trying to target a segment that big, it's like trying to place an ad at the Super Bowl. £100 does not buy you many seconds of advertising space at the Super Bowl. So weirdly, the bigger your audience, the fewer people see it, and the more specific your audience, the more people see it, because you have to pay much, much less per impression. It's a sort of odd it's kind of backwards how you would think it would work. This is a very interesting campaign in the same mode. This was the one we actually evaluated for the National Crime Agency. So, we were collecting information on the number of cyber attacks, so denial of service attacks, it's a form of cybercrime, being conducted around the world, in every country in the world, using some measuring equipment. And we graphed these over time, and we were looking to see, well, when the police do something, what happens? You arrest someone, you take down a service, does it affect the number of attacks on, for example, the UK, America? And we plotted these nice graphs. These have been normalized to the same. The orange, which is overlaid behind, is attacks on America, this type of attack. The blue one is attacks on the UK. These are attacks run by services, so you basically find a service that will do these attacks for you. You hit the button, and it sort of sends the attack off to the person. And what we found was that from 2016 to 2017, the UK and the US follow a very similar pattern. It's kind of going up. When one goes up, the other tends to go up. And then the same is true from mid-2018 to 2019, but there's this period of 6 months when the UK really starts to flatline. It's not going up nearly as fast, and actually it starts to go down. Now, we showed this graph to the National Crime Agency, and they got very, very excited. And they said, oh, this is when we were running our influence campaign. What this was if you Googled, how do I launch a cyber attack? How do I do this DDoS attack thing? What's the best DDoS service? You would get a National Crime Agency ad that said, don't do it. DDoS is illegal. Cybercrime is criminal. We're going to get you. And it seems to have had a real effect. The NCA officer said, actually, you can see here when my credit card that I was using for this ran out. So they were really pleased with it, yeah. But again, this is the part of the NCA's Cyber Choices program, which is basically, again, it's heavily focused on saying, choose the sort of person you want to be. It's this very sort of like, it uses a lot of techniques from essentially big corporate consumer advertising about identity, branding, values, this kind of thing. Again, this is kind of quite broad messaging, so it's not like secret or hidden, it's not like hypodermically targeted at like particular individuals. This is a really interesting type of campaign though. The opposite of that is what we call risk-based campaigning. So this is very much adapting the model of prevent, counter-terror, to doing these kind of nudges. Now, these are nudges that hit the exact person you want to hit in the exact moment you want them to see the communication, to try and nudge their behavior in that moment. And they use much, much, much more specific targeting. Now, most of the campaigns we're going to look at from now on use far, far more extensive and sophisticated forms of targeting. This is targeted at someone who's in the far right, and it's attempting to sort of get them on the path towards de-radicalization, to in this case, point them towards a service. And we can see here a much, much more sophisticated behavioral platform for targeting. So we can see this is targeting all genders, 16 to 30, people interested in first-person shooter games, online casinos, paddy power, sports betting. So that's who you do want to see it. But we don't want to show it to, so exclude people who are interested in animal equality, people who are interested in gender-neutral language, people who watch RuPaul's Drag Race, people who get The Guardian, right? And so, so it's really interesting. This is extremely sophisticated. It's based on a lot of research, and it's a really astonishing capacity for counter-radicalization or policing to have, to be able to say, well, this is who we do want to see it, this is who we don't want to see it, based on comprehensive surveillance by these platforms of your online life, people who engage a lot with soccer content, and a bunch of different areas. Now, this campaign has 3 different segments, and so I always use this one, both because of the extensiveness of the targeting, but also because it shows this segmentation. So this is what you get. This is the one that's targeted at the person who you're trying to de-radicalize. However, this is what you target at their mum. Right? A completely different communication, using completely different language, completely different images, and women aged 18 to 65 who shop at Asda, who shop at Waitrose, who like having staycations, who go on cruises, and who are in Wiltshire. I don't know why. So we can see again, almost certainly based on extensive research here, of people, a particular group of the population you're trying to target. And this is what you show that person's dad. Again, a completely different communication. Same, part of the same campaign, running at the same time. We're on a Remembrance Day, we're proud to be patriotic, but some groups exploit it if you're worried about a loved one, etc. So again, very different content. Now, the targeting on this is really interesting. This is men aged 28 to 64, who like Britain's Got Talent, Ricky Gervais, Jason Manford, read the Daily Mail, watch This Morning. So we can see again, and one of the things that's really interesting as a criminologist looking at this, is you can really see how people who try to do this work construct a particular category, right? It's sort of like a bit of a Rorschach test kind of thing. You can really see what's going on in this person's head as they're trying to build a segment. We can see exclude. What's interesting here is it excludes basically a lot of the American big like far-right influencers. So you don't want someone who is actively radicalized themselves. You want someone who's, and you can see here it's a kind of proxy for what I'm sure the person that made this believes is a kind of working class, vaguely right-wing sort of segment. Now the really interesting bit here is the locations. These are way more specific. These are 2 of the locations in this list. These are really, really small British towns. Minutes, gotcha. And as we can see, this is really, really specific. To my mind, this is including like an intelligence-led kind of thing, so this is based on areas that they are particularly worried about. We did check this stuff with SO15 to make sure we were allowed to show it. They said, yeah, it's old, so grand. So, I've only got 5 minutes, I won't go through that one, but here we can see a coordination campaign. This one is particularly interesting, and I think particularly controversial because of the use of ethnicity targeting as the next one, actually religious targeting. This is what we call a coordination campaign. So this is a pretty traditional police campaign. Join us at our public engagement event, but it's attempting to reach a group in the population that the police have a real difficulty in communicating with, reaching, etc. And we can see here, so it's clearly targeting religiously observant Muslims in Tower Hamlets. And we can see here, this is where it gets, I think, pretty problematic. There's a lot of sort of really invasive ethnicity-based targeting, behavioral targeting on how much people engage with content online during Ramadan, and some sort of quite questionable use of targeting here. Similarly, and I think this is a more complicated example ethically, so this is an example of I think this was security services. So this was, I think, MI5, a recruitment campaign. And this campaign is trying to target young black people in Britain to work for the security services in digital roles, essentially. Now that, having more diverse civil service, is a pretty good thing. But you cannot actually target on ethnicity on Facebook. Bans you from targeting based on ethnicity. So how does the government get around that? They do it in quite an interesting way, and I include this to show some of the ways that actually, even when the platform does restrict you in doing things, the state and police are usually quite creative in finding ways around it. So we see it's targeted at everyone aged 22 to 54, a range of universities. So Manchester Metropolitan is on there. You'll note that Oxford and Cambridge are not. They've presumably got other ways of recruiting people at Oxford and Cambridge. But what's really interesting is how they target ethnicity. So here, actually, the one I've done here is Liverpool. You can see it's individual postcodes of major British cities. So Liverpool is just L82, and Manchester is just M14-4 and M16-7. I've highlighted the Liverpool L82 postcode, so I used to be a census statistician, and immediately I said, I've got to look at what the census demographics of those postcodes are. This is the area of Liverpool they're targeting. Yeah? And that is 67.6% black, British, black, Welsh, Caribbean, and African. So we can see that they've taken another data set of evidence, joined it to the platform data, and used this to get around the restriction. This is my favourite one. This is a sort of, you know those, when you go shopping, sometimes you go to a supermarket and you see a sort of cardboard police officer. Has anyone seen these? This is a really basic nudge campaign. So the idea is you see the cardboard police officer and you think, police? Oh no, I must not commit crime. You don't, apparently. Apparently it does make a very small bit of a difference as to whether you shoplift. This is a sort of digital version of that. So this is in the action counter-terrorism sort of set of strategic areas. Essentially this pops up an advert on your phone based on your location when you walk in a particular postcode area, and it sort of says, there's a bunch of different adverts, but generally the message is either, don't worry, we've got loads of surveillance in this area, if anyone tries to do any terrorism, then they're going to be in real trouble, don't sweat it. And we were really interested in these postcodes, and we wanted to know what these postcodes were, and that is GL59, right there, it's GCHQ. So these are basically all sort of high security area, long list of about 50 of them in the UK. So you can see, you walk into the area, and one of these nudges pops up on your phone. I think this one's more of interest to sort of academic criminologists, I think. So this is a sort of what we call sort of territory campaign. So these tend to be, this is hitting a particular bit of London, basically. And if you're in this area in London, you'll start getting these ads on your phone. And this is saying, take an action to reduce burglary in Barnet. Your local policing team has been conducting high visibility patrols and other anti-burglary focused activity. So it's essentially a form of reassurance policing. And these are tailored to specific types of crime that the police survey says are a concern for populations in particular areas of London. Specifically, this area, burglary is a sort of concern that the public have. So it's quite interesting that the police are sort of using it for this sort of strategic purpose to shape the perceptions people have of crime and of the police, as well as to change their behaviour. This is where this is, so this is, to finish off, I'll talk a bit about where this is going. It should be no surprise to you, if you read the news, that the platform environment has changed a lot over the last couple of years. And actually, a lot of the major platforms, a lot of the major advertising platforms, like Meta, Twitter, Google, are not necessarily great places for governments to be anymore. They're pretty chaotic. A lot of people are leaving these platforms. And actually, even if Elon Musk wasn't doing the things he's doing just now, no one under the age of 25 is on Twitter anyway. So there's a real issue. If you're the police and you cultivate a big strategy around using Twitter to target young people, and they all move to a different platform, you just wasted all your money. And it then takes a lot of institutional effort and money to move to another platform, and they're gone already. And you think, oh, for goodness sake. So actually, this is where this is kind of moving to, which is the use of influencers. So rather than targeted advertising, the use of influencers. So particularly sort of prominent people in online social networks who have legitimacy, authority, and actually they sort the platform stuff out for you. They move, their sort of, audience moves with them, rather than the other way around. Now this is interesting. This is some of the stuff West Mids have been doing. I think the language they've used for this report probably read fine when they wrote it, but may in retrospect be slightly ill-judged. So a lot of this is about sort of authenticity, and this isn't really behavioural policing, this is more about cultivating impressions of policing and shaping public attitudes toward policing. But a lot of this is where the behavioural stuff is going. So it's saying, like, if we want to get particular behavioural outcomes, we'll promote them through the use of influencers who would provide strategically targeted behavioural communications. So, this is really weird. It's really, we think, quite new. It's potentially a really powerful preventative tool. It's also, I think I've probably demonstrated, potentially quite problematic. It gives an enormous amount of power to the police, to government, to target people on the basis of their online behaviour, in often ways that we might think are pretty intrusive and invasive. But yeah, it's something that's certainly being used by a lot of forces. If people want the data set, I'm happy to give you it, 16,000 ads to have a look at. And yeah, I'd be really interested to know what you think about it as well. So thank you very much for listening. You can have a read of, we've published quite a bit on it now. Some more critical, some less critical, more evaluative stuff. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. Great.